Oh hi, I'm the heretic. So how does libertarianism work? So how can we possibly prove the existence of property rights and defend them as foundational cores of our philosophy? They stem from first principles. So long as your argument derives itself from these axioms, then you don't actually need empirical evidence, because they could only possibly be wrong if the first principles are wrong. Now these ideas stem from Shane Killian's video on the same topic, link in the description. First principles shouldn't need to be defended. Now that's quite a claim, that any argument could be beyond reproach. Well, let's take a look at these principles and see if you can refute them. Good luck. The basic, most foundational principle is also the foundational principle of all reason and logic, the principle of non-contradiction. This one's pretty intuitive. Something cannot contradict itself. An apple cannot also not be an apple. An apple cannot also be an orange, as what makes something an apple is mutually exclusive with what makes it an orange. Now this is always true. This apple will continue to not be an orange, regardless of whether it is in New York City, see what I did there, Tokyo, or in orbit around Alpha Centauri. What I just described is called the consistency principle. If an argument fails on consistency, then it must be false. In a true dichotomy, where something is either an apple or an orange, all you have to do is falsify that it is an orange to prove that it's an apple. We know this is true because consistency is preferable, which we further know to be true because, well, consider the opposing statement. Consistency is not preferable. It contradicts itself, positing that it is consistently true that consistency is not preferable. Therefore, it is falsifiable, and the consistency is preferable statement must be correct. After all, the two are a true dichotomy. Only one of them could be correct. Therefore, the consistency principle. Now that we have our two first principles, let's apply them to interpersonal relationships. Burden of proof. Any action has two sides, a passive side and an active side. What if I told you the passive side had to justify their inaction? It couldn't be done. Think of all the things that you aren't doing right now. Driving an Abrams tank, skydiving, walking on the surface of the sun. The number of things you aren't doing right now is infinite. You couldn't possibly justify not doing everything. Therefore, the only consistent argument is that if you aren't doing anything, then you don't have to justify anything. Therefore, the burden of proof is always on the active side, not the passive side. That's not to make moral judgments about the active side always being wrong. That's absurd. All that burden of proof argues is that if a passive side is wrong, the burden of proof is on the active side to prove it. Now, force, by definition, is active. Therefore, those advocating for force have the burden of proof. If you're minding your own business, I have to justify any action I take against you, or wish to have done to you. Let's use a random example. Say I want to take your money. Because everything I've described so far is absolutely logically consistent, I cannot avoid having to justify my actions without rejecting all of reason entirely by violating the consistency principle, even if I call myself a government. From this, we get that the initiation of force cannot be justified. Gee, this sounds familiar. Think about the statement in reverse. The initiation of force can be justified. If so, then what right do I have to complain about being punched in the face if I punched someone else in the face earlier? The only consistent application is civil aggression, where all initiation of force is always justified. It must therefore argue that those not aggressing, the passive side, are always in the wrong for not aggressing to satisfy the burden of proof, and there are many things you could do that aren't aggressive. Eating, sleeping, or even being the last person alive with nobody to aggress against. So the justification of the initiation of force cannot satisfy the consistency principle. Therefore, the initiation of force cannot be justified. This is the logical proof of the non-aggression principle, the basis for all libertarian thought and policy. You cannot refute the non-aggression principle without finding either a flaw in my chain of logic or refuting the law of non-contradiction. That is your only recourse to proving anything I said to be incorrect and refuting the foundation of libertarian thought. Now let's go to the fun stuff, property rights. Property rights are derived from self-ownership. If you don't own yourself, then who does? If you're paying attention, yes, that's slavery. But who gets to own slaves, and who is made to be a slave? To make these distinctions is to create an inconsistency in how slavery is applied. Nor can you say that nobody owns you. Ownership implies control of what happens to it. So if nobody owns you, anyone can do anything to you, including murdering you, and we've already talked about the problem with aggression. The only consistent answer is that you own yourself. Your body, mind, thoughts, and that which derives from them, as well as the right to defend yourself from aggressors. From self-ownership, we get private property. When you pick an apple, it is your thoughts and your body that brought the apple from the tree to your possession. Therefore, it belongs to you and you alone. If someone else says something you want, you can trade for it. You may transfer ownership of your apple to me to convince me to transfer my ownership of my orange to you. Alternatively, I agree to provide labor to your apple orchard for property in exchange. In fact, you can do this for any property you own, except one, yourself. What makes self-ownership a unique form of property is that you cannot separate you from yourself. No matter where you go, there you are. You may separate yourself from your apple or your kidney, but not yourself. Therefore, you cannot sell yourself into slavery. To do so is to create the inconsistencies I described earlier. Now let's just suppose that I take your apples. In so doing, I am presuming ownership over your labor, the effort you put in to either get your apples or to acquire the resources to trade for it. By assuming ownership over a person's labor, I assume ownership over your person, making you my slave. Violating the consistency principle, therefore, through pure rationalist a priori logic, we can determine that the taking of legitimately owned property cannot be justified. Now, property may be transferred through compensation of damages, theft, or failure to meet obligations. Burden of proof puts property ownership as passive and the taking as active, therefore it must be justified. But in the absence of breach of mutually agreed upon contract or damages, the taking of legitimately owned property cannot be justified. Similarly, action made under duress is automatically invalid, since it violates the non-aggression principle. So what does this mean? Property rights and the non-aggression principle can be proven by simply taking the first principles of logic and reason and applying them consistently in interpersonal relationships. With it, we can prove that all statist arguments are inherently inconsistent. The government's existence cannot be justified. Government is a territorial monopoly on the initiation of force. Taxation violates self-ownership and therefore the consistency principle. Legislation also violates self-ownership as it usurps self-ownership in dictating how you may or may not act. Therefore, it's violating the consistency principle once again. Make no mistake, taxes and legislation is slavery by another name. Taxation and legislation cannot exist independent of government. A government that does not tax or legislate is no government at all. To argue for government is to argue for the initiation of force and against self-ownership in the consistency principle. Therefore, to argue for government is to reject all science, logic, and reason. Want to prove me wrong? Here's what you don't do. Don't ask me who will build the roads. Don't tug at my heartstrings or argue that anarcho-capitalism isn't anarchism. Let me tell you exactly how to prove me wrong. Find the fault in my chain of logic. Do the links not fit together? Am I missing one? If you can find the break in this logic chain or prove the rule of non-contradiction to be false, I will cease to be a libertarian, but I'm not holding my breath. Questions, comments, critique? What other ways does statism violate first principles? Should we start a betting pool on how long until someone proves the rule of non-contradiction false? Like, share, and subscribe to become a heretic today.
So let me begin with a few remarks on libertarianism as a pure deductive theory. If there were no scarcity in the world, human conflicts would be impossible. Interpersonal conflicts are always and everywhere conflicts concerning scarce objects, scarce things. I want to do X with a certain thing, and you want to do Y with a certain thing, and that must lead to conflict. And because of such conflicts, we seek out norms of behavior with the very purpose of avoiding conflicts. If we did not want to avoid conflicts, the search for norms of conduct would be obviously senseless. We would simply fight and struggle. Absent now a perfect harmony of all interests, conflicts regarding scarce resources can only be avoided if all scarce resources are assigned as private exclusive property to some specified individual or individuals. That is logically so. But who owns what scarce resource as his private property and who does not? Now, first, each person owns his physical body that only he and no one else can control directly. Only I can lift up my arm. You can lift up my arm only indirectly by first using your physical body. So each person owns his physical body because only he can control it directly. And you own your body because only you can control it directly, and everybody can control your bodies only indirectly. Otherwise, if body ownership were assigned to some indirect body controller, conflict would become unavoidable, as a direct body controller cannot give up his direct control over his body as long as he is alive. And second, as far as scarce resources are concerned that can be controlled only indirectly, namely by our own nature-given and unappropriated body, that is, exclusive control over property is acquired by and assigned to that person who appropriated the resource in question first, or who acquired it through a voluntary, conflict-free exchange from its previous owner. For only the first person, the first appropriator of a resource, and all later owners connected to him through a chain of voluntary exchanges, can possibly acquire and gain control over this resource without a conflict, that is, peacefully. Otherwise, if exclusive control is assigned instead to latecomers, conflict is not avoided, but contrary to the very purpose of norms, conflict is made unavoidable. Now, let me emphasize that I consider this theory essentially irrefutable, as a priori true. In my estimation, this theory, which I'm only indicated now, of course, this theory represents one of the greatest, if not the greatest, achievement of social thought. It formulates and codifies the immutable ground rules for all people everywhere who wish to live together in peace.
Here's the thing about logic. It's completely objective. There's no my logic or your logic. There's just logic. So if you have a logical position, then it's an objective argument that stems from first principles. First principles are foundational propositions and axioms that do not have to be defended. As long as your argument is purely from first principles, meaning that it's linked back to these first principles with no breaks in the chain and no fallacious reasoning, then you don't actually need empirical evidence to support it, because then the only way for the conclusion to be wrong would be for these first principles to be wrong as well. The first principle we'll look at is a foundational principle of all logic and reason, the principle of non-contradiction. Something cannot be A and not A at the same time. Also, if something is A, then it cannot be B if A and B are mutually exclusive. It may be possible for something that is A to later turn into B, but once it does, it cannot be A anymore. Directly from this we get the consistency principle. In logic, consistency means that you don't contain any contradictions. So long as the principle of non-contradiction holds, the consistency principle does as well. While there are proofs of consistency, for purposes of this video, we'll just look at falsifiability. If we can find inconsistency in a posit, then the posit must be rejected. So if A and B are mutually exclusive and a true dichotomy, then falsifying A is all that you have to do to support B and vice versa. Ironically, the consistency principle itself can be supported in this way. Consider the following claims. Consistency is preferable. Consistency is not preferable. This is a true dichotomy. One or the other must be true, but both cannot be. But if we examine these statements, we see that consistency is not preferable is a consistent principle, and therefore self-contradictory. By the principle of non-contradiction, we therefore reject it and accept consistency as being preferable. It's the consistency principle that leads us to establish burden of proof. The burden of proof is on the active side, not the passive side. There are a lot of things you're not doing right now. Maybe you're not collecting stamps at the moment. You're not walking on the moon. You're not inventing the hoverboard. You're not annexing the Sudetenland. There's an infinity of things you're not doing at the time. Imagine if someone said you had to justify every single one of them. There's no way you could do it. It would be inconsistent for someone to insist that you had to justify one or some of the things you're not doing, since you can't possibly justify them all. The only principle consistent with the consistency principle is that if you're not doing something, you don't have to justify it to anybody. The burden of proof is never on the passive side. Which means that the burden of proof must be on the active side when the active side conflicts with a passive side. In the theism-atheism debate, atheists take the passive side. They see no reason to believe in God, so they decline to. You don't have to defend not believing in God any more than you have to defend not inventing the hoverboard. But since belief is active, the theist is taking the active position, and therefore the burden of proof is on those who claim that God exists. Let me be clear about this. We're talking about the burden of proof. We are not concluding that it is always right and proper to take the passive side. Sometimes the passive side might well be in the wrong. But if you want to claim that the passive side is wrong, the burden of proof is on you to establish that. Everything so far is absolutely consistent with established logic, and you cannot doubt any of this without running afoul of the basic principles of logic and rational thought. They are the basis of all science and reason. You cannot reject the principles we've talked about so far without rejecting all of science and reason as well. Now, going from nothing more than these first principles, let's see how this works in the libertarian status debate. Force is active. Ergo, those who want to use force have the burden of proof. Those who do not have no such burden at all. There really is no way around this. If someone's just sitting there not doing anything, the burden is on you to justify any action taken against him, like, say, taking some of his money. And you can't worm your way out of this just by calling yourself a government. That is a blatant violation of the consistency principle. You can't have different rules for government than you do for the rest of us. Even if the person is taking an action, if everyone affected by the action agrees to it, the burden of proof is on you if you want to interfere. So if one person hires another, and that person agrees to work for wages of $7 an hour, and you think that's too low, that it should be $10 or $15 an hour, the burden of proof is on you to justify your intrusion into this voluntary, private, peaceful exchange. So I know you statists are now chomping at the bit, getting your arguments all ready to justify the forceful actions your government does. But hold on, because initiation of force cannot be defended. Person A hires person B at $7 an hour. Person C, thinking person B should be paid at least $10 an hour, wants to point a gun at person A and make him pay person B more money. Is he justified in this? Think about it. What if person A then wants to point a gun back at person C because he doesn't want to be forced to do something he doesn't want to do? What's person C going to do? Say that person A doesn't get to use force, even though person C is doing what he's doing through force? How does person C have any legitimacy here at that point? It gets worse. Let's say that person D disagrees with person C's interference and points a gun at him. If the initiation of force is defensible, then who is acting in the wrong here? And even worse, After person C makes person A pay person B more money, person E points a gun at person C and makes him do something he thinks he should do, like give up his collection of pornography. How does person C have any logical defense if he wants to complain about it? Under the consistency principle, if one is valid, the other must be too. The only way compatible with the consistency principle is that the initiation of force is never justified, which means that the non-initiation of force principle, also known as the non-aggression principle, the basis of all libertarianism, is the only principle compatible with consistent logic. And since this argument was made in an unbroken chain from first principles, you cannot refute it. Your only recourse is to try to find a flaw in my logic up to this point, some link in the chain that was skipped or doesn't work for some reason. That is the only option to you if you want to deny the non-aggression principle. It's now time to turn to the basis for all libertarian political policy: property rights. While non-initiation of force is the guiding principle, property rights is the logical structure we use to determine who is initiating force and when. This isn't a pragmatic idea, it too is based on first principles. We start with the principle of self-ownership. Basically, you own yourself. You own your body, your mind, your time, and the fruits of your labors. Why? Well, what would it mean if you didn't? Who else would own you? If someone else can own you, that would make you their slave. But slavery completely violates the consistency principle. Who gets to own slaves, and who is subject to being enslaved? You would be making different rules for different people, which you don't get to do. Even if your answer is that no one would own you, you still have a problem. If something isn't owned, then no one can stop someone from doing whatever they want to it. If no one owns a rock, there's nothing stopping anyone from picking it up and using it for whatever purpose they want. So if no one owns you, then anyone can do whatever they want to you, including raping and murdering you. So you run into a problem with the consistency principle again. Since ownership of something means having control over what happens to it, the only consistent principle is self-ownership, which means that you get to make the decisions that affect only yourself, and you get to defend yourself against others who would impose their will on you. Giving anyone else the legitimacy to do so runs into fundamental inconsistency problems. That would mean you can't defend yourself. That would mean that no one else has any legitimacy in stopping them. And what happens if someone else wants to rape you instead? How do you determine which of them has the right to rape you? Get the picture? So self-ownership is the only consistent way, and that naturally leads to private property. How can one claim ownership over private property? Only if it's an extension of one's right to self-ownership. So someone can own something one of two ways. 1. He can do it himself, or make it himself, or whatever. So long as he doesn't intrude on anyone else's property rights to do so, whatever is the product of his own actions, his own mind, his own labor, rightly belongs to him and no one else. 2. He can trade for it, or otherwise convince the proper owner of something to transfer ownership to him. If he makes an axe, he can trade it for a saw, and the saw is his. Likewise, the other person gives up the saw and takes ownership of the axe. Or he can trade his labor. He can agree to work a certain number of hours and receive property in return. For example, he might do some work for his landlord in exchange for letting him stay there. In fact, he can engage in any kind of voluntary contract he wants, except one. There's one piece of property he owns that he can never give up: himself. You can give an axe because the axe can be separated from you. You can donate your kidney because your kidney was separated from you. But there's no way you can be separated from yourself. No matter where you go, there you are. So although the consistency principle allows for the trading of private property, it doesn't actually let you transfer ownership of yourself. Any contract where you sell yourself into slavery is therefore completely invalid. But an axe, or a few hours a day, you can voluntarily trade that for whatever you believe is fair. Normally, of course, these exchanges are made for money because barter gets out of hand really fast. So you're more likely to sell your axe or work for a certain wage. You can then use the money to trade for other things in the economy. Money is just another form of property. It simply has the features of being a medium of exchange and a store of value. There's nothing special about it. Working for someone in exchange for money in no way makes you a slave or anything else statists like to bleat on about. By the same token, there's no legitimacy whatsoever to the claim that we don't own money, it's all the government's. If you received it in exchange for your labor, you own it. To say anything else would be to deny self-ownership and all the principles on which it is based, and that would make the person a slave, as well as violating the consistency principle and therefore all of science and reason. So from nothing more than a logical examination of first principles, we come to the following inescapable conclusion. Taking of legitimately owned property cannot be defended. Owning property is passive. Taking that property is active. At the very least, as we discussed earlier, the burden of proof is on the side of the property taker. This is why a plaintiff in court must prove his case before the court will pass a judgment for compensation. The only time this is legitimate is when the person has taken or damaged his property or otherwise not lived up to his end of a contract. If person A has stolen property from person B, he can be made to give it back, or give the equivalent amount of money. Likewise, if person A damages person B's property, person A can be made to pay damages to fix everything. Or if person A borrows money from person B to buy a house and then doesn't pay it back, person B can then foreclose on person A's house. But when there has been no contract, no taken or damaged property, when no such obligation can ever be shown, you run into big problems with the consistency principle. By the very effect we talked about before with self-ownership, likewise, private property cannot be usurped by others. So burden of proof in this context means only that you can prove that the person has an obligation based on positive action he himself has taken to agree with it. That's it. And that positive action cannot be the result of duress. Duress is an initiation of force, and so any contracts made under that force, or the threat of it, are automatically invalid. So from first principles, taxation is theft. Using force to take a portion of someone's wages denies the very concept of self-ownership, and therefore denies the principle of non-contradiction, and all of science and reason go with it. That also makes the so-called social contract a failure right on the face of it. Even without having to go into what the courts have said about tacit consent and the rest, the social contract contravenes these very basic property rights. And since these rights are based on nothing more than first principles, the social contract fails right from the start. And you can't get around it by saying, but government built the roads you drive on. Remember, if it's done by force, it's duress, and the whole thing is invalid. The social contract is also a direct violation of the consistency principle too. Whereas a normal contract requires positive mutual agreement and a meeting of the minds, the social contract gives special powers to a certain group of people known as the government. Powers we've shown they cannot possibly have in any way compatible with the consistency principle. So there you have it. Property rights and the non-aggression principle stem directly from first principles. And statism, along with concepts such as wage slavery, the legitimacy of taxation, the social contract, labor theory of value, and pretty much everything else the state does, all violate first principles. Statists, your only way out of this is to try and show a flaw in the logic I've presented, where either some link in the chain of logic was skipped, or some fallacious reasoning was used somewhere. That's it. There is no empirical data, no emotional argument, no amount of fear-mongering, no lifeboat scenario that will help you. Who will build the roads, or libertarians are selfish, or there's never been a libertarian society will likewise do nothing. These are arguments from first principles. They cannot be denied.
Most conflict, violence, and injustice is the result not of individual malice, but of people imagining an obligation to obey a perceived authority, usually government. In their daily lives, most people accept the non-aggression principle. It's not okay to rob or attack other people. But they've been taught that government has an exemption from that rule, and that legalized theft and thuggery, taxation and law enforcement, are moral, legitimate, and necessary for society. Here are 3 independent proofs that the concept of government is not just susceptible to corruption and abuse, but is, by its very nature, self-contradictory and insane. Number 1, there is no document or procedure whereby any person or group of people can delegate to another a right which the first person or group didn't have to begin with. Ergo, Congress cannot have acquired and does not have the right to do anything that you don't have the right to do yourself. 2, you can't have a moral obligation to do what you think is wrong. Whenever there's a conflict between what authority commands and your own conscience, you have the right to disobey. But if that's true, then the one giving orders isn't authority, since authority means the one with the right to rule you and the one you must obey. 3, no document or ritual can alter morality and make an evil act good. Either man-made law matches objective morality, in which case the law is redundant and irrelevant, or it conflicts with objective morality, in which case it is illegitimate and should be disobeyed. Either way, legislation never creates any obligation to obey, and therefore has no authority. Once all of this is widely understood, that's the end of most of the theft, thuggery, oppression, and war in the world, which happens now as a result of the belief in government, meaning a rightful ruling class. If evil were committed only by genuinely nasty people, instead of being condoned and committed by almost everyone, all those who imagine that legalizing evil makes it good and imagine that agents of authority have rights the rest of us don't, the world would be a far more peaceful and just place. Amen. Now, if you have more than 2 minutes to spare and want a thorough explanation of this, then get a copy of The Most Dangerous Superstition.
What natural law is all about is the objective difference between right behavior and wrong behavior. I always tell people that, we use the same word to communicate the idea of correct and moral. We use the word right to communicate those concepts. Correct means based in truth. And moral means that it is in harmony with natural law principles, because when you take a right action, the result of that action does not result in harm to other beings, to other sentient beings. Conversely, wrong behavior is both incorrect and immoral. Incorrect meaning it is not based in truth, and immoral meaning it is in opposition to natural law, because when we take wrong behaviors, someone is harmed as a result of that behavior, of that behavioral choice. The problem is, folks, most people still in the year 2018, sad as though it may be to say, cannot properly define a right. They cannot give you the definition of what a right behavior is. And that's why we're losing our rights. Because they do not understand that a right is an action that does not cause harm to another sentient being. And that is the definition, and it is as simple as that. I've rewatched the movie K-Pax recently. And it's about an alien being that comes to the earth and interacts with, the primitive human beings that can't understand his mindset. And when he's asked if his planet has a government, he says, we have no need for a government. And he's like, well, how do your people know right from wrong? And his answer is, every being in the universe knows the difference between right and wrong.
So, what about societal structure? Government?
No, there's no need for one.
You have no laws?
No laws, no lawyers.
How do you know right from wrong?
Every being in the universe knows right from wrong, Mark.
That's the real answer to that question. This should be common sense knowledge, but we're so backwards as a species that I need a 9-hour presentation to explain to brainwashed people what the difference between right and wrong behavior is. I've said in past presentations, sometimes I sit up at night and laugh at the ridiculousness of what I do. Really. I laugh at how ridiculous having to present basic information like this is. And yet the majority of human beings, it's falling on deaf ears. The following actions are examples of the initiation of aggression against others, which is what all wrongdoings are. These actions are violations against natural rights and therefore constitute violence. Murder, assault, rape, theft, trespass, and coercion. And you could think all you want about any wrongdoing that can possibly be committed. I've challenged many, many people to do this, and you will recognize every single wrongdoing that can be committed against another human being is a form of theft. There is only one wrong, theft, in one form or another, and there is only one law in the universe. Don't steal. That's it. Every wrongdoing comes down to an act of theft, provably. Murder is the taking without just cause of the life of another, which does not belong to you. Assault is the taking without just cause of another being's physical well-being, which does not belong to you. Rape is the taking of another's free will sexual consent, which does not belong to you. Theft is the taking of property, physical property, which does not belong to you. Trespass is the taking of the security of another person in their domain, in their dwelling place, which does not belong to you to take. Coercion is the taking of another being's free will, which does not belong to you to take. Every wrongdoing is a form of theft. There's no wrongdoing anyone can think of that is not a form of theft. Natural law versus man's law. Natural law is based upon principles and truth which are inherent to creation. Man's law is based upon dogmatic belief systems which are the constructs of a diseased mind. Natural law is only ever harmonized with due to knowledge and understanding, or not harmonized with due to ignorance. Man's law, on the other hand, is only complied with due to fear of punishment. Natural law is universal. It exists and applies anywhere in the universe, regardless of location. Man's law differs with location based upon the whim of the legislators who are making up these decrees and commands. And that is a form of moral relativism, the idea that we can decide what right and wrong are, that they are not objective and inherent to creation because they are based upon actions. Natural law is eternal and immutable. That means it exists and applies for as long as the universe exists, and it cannot ever be changed by any action that any being within the universe can do. Man's law, on the other hand, changes with time based upon the whim of legislators, which is also moral relativism. If a man-made law is in harmony with natural law, it follows logically that it is redundant, since it is stating a truth that is inherent, pre-existing, eternal, and self-evident, or it should be self-evident. Therefore, man's law is both irrelevant and unnecessary. If a man-made law is in opposition to natural law, it follows logically that it is both false, meaning it is incorrect, and it is immoral, meaning it is harmful. It results in harm to other beings. Or in other words, it's wrong. Therefore, man's law that is in opposition to natural law can never be legitimately binding upon anyone. Therefore, I say throw all of man's law out. We don't need it. We only need to understand and bring our behavior into compliance with natural law. That's it. And then we would experience a society based in freedom. Because as we engage in moral behavior, a society in the aggregate becomes more free. And as we engage in immoral behavior, a society in the aggregate becomes more enslaved. That is the natural law of freedom. There is a law that governs the freedom of a whole society. As morality increases, freedom increases. As morality declines, freedom declines.
You humans. Sometimes it's hard to imagine how you've made it this far.